Welcome back, America. Alex Safian is Associate Director and Research Director of CAMRA, Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, and they're doing a fantastic job. I bookmarked their site because they're monitoring what the media are doing and what they're reporting, and they're providing that to we, the American people. So I think it's important that we hear about this. Alex, for the most part, how are the American media doing?
Not well. Not well. There are exceptions here and there, but for the most part, not well at all. Here's a telling example. It's a window into the mind of Christian Amanpour, if you're willing to take that risk. Christian Amanpour has been talking about Palestinian casualties. You know, many in the media now are saying the Hamas-controlled Gaza Ministry of Health to make clear that maybe the numbers are not that reliable. Christian Amanpour has found a way around that. She says, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Ramallah, that's what she's quoting for casualty numbers. But where do they get their numbers? They're not on the ground in Gaza. They're getting their numbers from the Gaza Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. So she is laundering the casualty statistics. She is, instead of saying these are Hamas numbers, she's saying it comes from the PA in Ramallah, trying to launder the numbers. Now, why would she do that, right? Why would she go out of her way to make Israel look as bad as possible and make the Palestinian side look as good as possible by covering up the fact that these are very unreliable Hamas numbers? These are propaganda numbers coming out of Hamas in Gaza. She does this all the time. This is one example of where she does her best to make Israel look as bad as possible and make the Palestinians look as good as possible. This, unfortunately, is typical of a lot of what goes on CNN. Not everything. Not every report, but the majority of reports, the vast majority of reports, and she's just a typical example of that. I can give you another example that this is, again, a window into the mind of these reporters. New York Times Middle East correspondent Raja Abdul Rahim, she tweeted the following on November 6th. Siege, bombardment, striking bakeries, targeting hospitals, preventing aid. We've seen these military tactics before in Syria. She is comparing Israel to Syria, which is incredible. Now, she has a history. When she was in college, she actually wrote a letter to her college newspaper saying that Hamas and Hezbollah are not terrorist organizations. She said this when she was on a scholarship from CARE, the Committee on American-Islamic Relations, which, of course, you've talked about it a lot, is a Hamas front group and is an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terrorism financing trial in our country's history. So that's how you get hired at the New York Times, or the LA Times first, where her first job, and then the New York Times. It doesn't, you know, having opinions like that and claiming that Hamas and Hezbollah are not terrorist groups is not disqualifying if you want to get a job at the New York Times, the LA Times, or Amnesty International, or Human Rights Watch, which are all a huge part of the problem in this propaganda war against Israel.
Now, let's talk about the New York Times for a moment. There have been many scholars who've written very thorough books that are absolutely unchallenged on how the New York Times covered up the Holocaust for the most part. The New York Times put out an apology in 2001, which was a semi-apology on its 150th year anniversary. It just seems to me, if you're going to cover up the Holocaust, then that rots pretty deep at the New York Times. The New York Times hired and then fired a man who was praising Hitler, who was a photographer for them in Gaza, and they just hired this guy back. The New York Times put out anti-Semitic cartoons, not one, two. They since apologized for them. What do you make of the New York Times? The whole culture there seems to be really corrupt.
It is. They have a serious Jewish problem because the ownership, the Sulzberger family, has a Jewish history, which they're very uncomfortable with. This has been going back to the 1920s, when they actually stuck up for some Jewish interests and spoke out against anti-Semitism and got slammed as being Jews, as being unreliable, as only taking a Jewish point of view on things. And ever since then, really, the New York Times has tried to bend over backwards to show that they are not a particularly Jewish newspaper or Jewish ownership newspaper. The ownership is really the problem here. It's been true through the generations. And the people that you mentioned who've written about it, they've covered this. I mean, it's well known that they have a real Jewish problem. There's no question about it. It was true with the riots in New York, the anti-Jewish pogrom that Al Sharpton helped trigger in New York, where they did not cover what was going on. They covered it as fighting between Jews and blacks in New York. And that was not what was happening. It was a pogrom, an anti-Jewish pogrom. And the New York Times for days didn't cover it, as even some of their own reporters later came out and said they were calling in stories, and that was not what was being published by the paper. The paper was not publishing the stories that were called in by their reporters. So there's no question they have a Jewish problem and they have an Israel problem. There's no question about it. And we see that in their coverage over and over again. They lead journalism in the world and in America for sure, and that's where the problem really starts.
When we come back, Alex Safian of camera.org. I want to ask you about MSNBC, which to me is also a particularly grotesque so-called journalism operation, the hosts that they have there, the propaganda that they push. It seems to be, to me, really filled with hate towards Israel, not hate for America, quite frankly. We'll be right back.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.